Hi, I'm going to talk about reactive hypoglycemia and carbohydrates. If you haven't seen my videos on the cause and cure with reactive hypoglycemia, watch those first and then watch this one. It'll be better for you. Um, so carbohydrates, there are a lot of forms and there are a lot of different carbohydrates. I'm going to talk about two aspects of them. I'm going to take one, I'm going to look at the ratio between carbs and proteins and fats in a few different foods. And the other thing I'm going to look at is glycemic load. Glycemic load is basically how much the foods that you eat are raising your blood glucose level, which if you're reactive hypoglycemic is bad. And again, the approach that I'm looking at is the problem with reactive hypoglycemia is that you're producing too much insulin. So the approach I'm taking is that you want to get to the point to where you're not producing too much insulin anymore. Now to get there is a little bit tricky because I'll talk about, I was hypoglycemic for about 25 years or so. And the problem that I had was that anytime I ate, my insulin levels, boom, they went way up. So even if I were to eat foods that didn't have a lot of sugar in them and weren't bringing my blood glucose levels up, so I say I ate, steak and salad. Well, those would bring my blood glucose up a little bit, but not a lot. But my insulin levels would be really high. And then the insulin would take out my sugar and I'd be left with really low blood sugar. So what I actually had to do, I always had to eat some sugar or carbs with my meal because my insulin levels were always high. I didn't have, normal people, a little bit of sugar, or a little bit of insulin, medium amount, medium amount. Not me, I had a little bit, but I had a lot. My insulin setting was high. I always had a lot of insulin. And so I had to eat a lot of sugar so they would balance out and then come down together. And so that's one of the problems if you're trying to overcome your hypoglycemia. And it took me 9 months to get beyond that. So what I did was I ate foods which stimulated my insulin production less and less than I did behavioral changes and also timing changes with my diet. So I got to the point where I just wasn't overproducing insulin anymore. And again, it took me 9 months. And it takes a lot of discipline. It takes a very intelligent approach. But we're going to talk about carbs today. So this idea of good carbs and bad carbs is total, complete nonsense. It's one of the many things which just drives me crazy when people talk about nutrition. For example, broccoli has good carbs. It's not the carbohydrates in broccoli which are good. It's all the vitamins and phytonutrients, and they have a little protein and some fiber. It's the other stuff in broccoli which is good, not the carbohydrates. White bread is bad carbohydrates. Well, it's nothing particularly bad about the carbohydrates in white bread. White bread just has little to no nutritional value whatsoever. And so in broccoli, you're getting a bunch of other good stuff, and white bread, you're not. It's not the carbohydrates which are good and bad. It's the other stuff which is good and bad. Cholesterol's got the same problem. People talk about good cholesterol and bad cholesterol, which is just a bunch of nonsense. Cholesterol is the exact same molecule every time. There's nothing good or bad about it. It's just cholesterol. Anyways, that's a different topic. So looking at some foods, just taking a few examples, and I'm going to look at the ratio between fat, protein, and carbohydrates. Now with carbohydrates, I do not include fiber in this. For me, fiber is a separate class. I don't like that when they put carbohydrates, they include fiber with it, because for reactive hypoglycemia, fiber is not initiating an insulin response for you, because we don't digest fiber in our stomach. We don't digest it in the upper part of our small intestine, duodenum, which is where we're getting our insulin responses from. Fiber isn't digested until it gets down to the bacteria, which are much further down our intestinal path. And the bacteria actually can digest fiber for us, but it's not producing an insulin response. So I am not including fiber in my carbohydrates here. So just a couple examples. Broccoli. I looked up a broccoli chart. Now the ratio of fat to protein to carbs in broccoli is fat 1, protein 6, carbohydrates 3, which actually isn't too bad. It's got a good amount of protein and a little bit of fat and not so many carbs. So broccoli is not so bad. Carrots, fat 1, protein 5, fat 34. This is the ratio. Part of that, or I'm sorry, carbohydrates 34. Part of that's because there's very little fat. But the ratio between fat, protein, and carbs in carrots is 1 to 5 to 34 because the fat's really, really low. Tomatoes, the ratio of fat, protein to carbs is 1 to 6 to 16. And again, a lot of that's because tomatoes are very low in fat. Now, if you look at the glycemic load of those, broccoli, the glycemic load is 1, which is low. Carrots are 3, which is pretty low, and tomatoes are 1. The glycemic load index says that 1 to 10 is low, 10 to 20 is medium, and over that's high. But if you're reactive hypoglycemic, over 20 is terrible. 10 to 20 is really high. And I actually think even above 4 and 5, if you have reactive hypoglycemia, that's pretty big because those are stimulating an insulin response. Now, everybody's different. Everybody's reaction is different. But I can tell you, for example, tomatoes, I couldn't have tomatoes by themselves. I would get low blood sugar because I get a high insulin response. And the reason I would get a high insulin response is because there's very little fat. And actually, it's not that high in carbs, but the ratio is 1 to 16. For every gram of fat, there are 16 grams of carbohydrates. And so for me, it would give me a really strong insulin response. Carrots, same deal. It's not that carrots are bad food. Carrots have lots of good stuff in them. They just don't have any fat. Carbohydrates, if you have reactive hypoglycemia, carbohydrates are bad. In that, they are stimulating an insulin response. And again, my premise is that the problem with reactive hypoglycemia is that you're overproducing insulin. Hyperactive beta cells overproducing insulin. And then too much insulin takes too much sugar out of your blood. And so if you're stimulating insulin production, then you get low blood sugar, and that's the problem. Again, it's a tricky road to get to where you don't have a problem with it, because again, my case was that even if I weren't eating foods that were stimulating insulin production, I already had this problem of overproducing. I already had this hyperactive insulin production going on. So I had to eat something to balance it, and it took me a long time to calm it down. Now, if I take the foods which I would recommend in the long term, these are the foods that you want to eat. I looked at cheddar cheese. Now, the ratio of fat to protein to carbs in cheddar cheese is 9 fat to 7 protein to 0 carbs. And it's not even on the glycemic load charts that I can find because it's not producing a noticeable insulin response, generally speaking. Avocados, fantastic food. Boy, so nutritious too. Avocados, ratio of fat to protein to carbs, 8 to 1 to 1. This is much better if you're reactive hypoglycemic than broccoli, carrots, and tomatoes. And broccoli, carrots, and tomatoes are all really healthy food. I'm strictly talking about not producing an insulin response. And if you don't want to produce an insulin response, then carbohydrates are bad. Broccoli is wonderful, but the carbs in it, not so good. Carrots got a lot of good stuff, but again, the carbs, not very good. Tomatoes, same story. Almonds, looking at one more food, almonds. The ratio of fat to protein to carbs in almonds is 6 fat to 2 protein to 1 carb. These are the foods that you want to get to where you're not stimulating your insulin response. Cheeses, avocados, first-class olive oil, fantastic food. Not the stuff that's in the supermarkets, but the stuff that you put in your mouth, and if you do that slurpaggio, it's so spicy you can't keep it in it, but fantastic food for you. And so when you're looking at glycemic load, you can find charts, which aren't so easy to find, and it's even harder to find complete charts now on the internet. But the factors and things that produce a higher blood glucose level are basically how much sugar they have, how much carbs they have, how dense, how concentrated those sugars and carbohydrates are, how quickly it goes through your stomach. The faster they go through your stomach, the more of a blood glucose spike that you're going to get. For instance, looking up grapes and raisins. Raisins are dried grapes. 120 grams of grapes on the glycemic load chart that I saw was an 8, which is 1 to 10 is considered low for regular people. 8 is pretty high if you have reactive hypoglycemia. In my opinion, 8 is pretty high. But that was 120 grams of grapes, 60 grams of raisins on the glycemic load. So 28, which is just super high. And the thing is, I used to actually eat raisins on a daily basis, which is probably, I'm sure, is part of the reason I had such a big problem with hypoglycemia. I used to have white rice with cinnamon, milk, raisins, and then I would put a little sugar in it when I was really young. That's my father used to make for a Sunday breakfast. And anyways, I had to cut all that stuff out, but I had to do so progressively, step by step. Point is, you dry up those grapes, which are already high in sugar, and now your glycemic load went from an 8 to 28 with half the serving. It's a tremendous increase in the spike in your blood glucose levels. So if you're hypoglycemic, if you have reactive hypoglycemia, dried fruits are bad. They're worse than bad. They're terrible. You're getting a major insulin response from those things. Again, your blood glucose response is going to be copied by your insulin response. And the whole approach I'm taking is you don't want to stimulate insulin production. You want to do anything you can with your diet and your behavior and your surroundings to keep your insulin production low. You want consistently low blood glucose levels and consistently low insulin levels. Looking at a couple other things. White potatoes on this glycemic load, 26. White potatoes are terrible. White bread was a 10, which is kind of surprising that it was so low to me. White bread was a 10. Whole grain bread is a 7, which a 7 is considered low for normal people. But if you have reactive hypoglycemia again, I think you want to stay even lower. Another point I want to make is if you look at fruits versus fruit juice, generally speaking, more or less, the juice has double the glycemic load figure that the fruit does. And so you're getting twice the spike from drinking apple juice as opposed to eating an apple, or drinking orange juice as opposed to eating an orange. You're getting twice the spike in your blood glucose levels, which is going to correlate to a much larger spike in your insulin levels, which is not what you want. So carbohydrates with reactive hypoglycemia. Grains are particularly not good because they don't have any nutritional value for you. Spaghetti noodles, macaroni noodles, white bread, white rice, all these things, they don't have much of value for you at all, but they're producing a very significant insulin response, which is not what you want if you have reactive hypoglycemia. Things like broccoli, fruits are high in sugar, but boy, they sure do have a lot of good stuff in them. But broccoli, carrots, and tomatoes, all really good foods, all will produce an insulin response, but you got to eat something, right? And the other thing is you want to have a balanced diet. You want to, especially when you're starting, because everybody's different. But probably if you've been hypoglycemic for a while, and you say, okay, I know I need to eat cheese, avocados, almonds, olive oil, but if you're still getting a high insulin response and that's not balanced by your blood sugar level, then you're going to end up with low blood sugar anyways. And so it's a long-term approach. But with the carbohydrates, pay attention to what carbohydrates you're eating. Added sugars are poison. No business eating. If you have reactive hypoglycemia, no business eating added sugars of any type. And by the way, all those OSes, dextrose, galactose, fructose, etc., maltose, anything with the OSE is a sugar, and it's producing a major insulin response in you, probably. So added sugars, no business eating. You want to get completely 100% away from those. Simple carbohydrates are really bad. Complex carbohydrates are better in that they don't produce an immediate insulin response as much as simple carbs do, but the downside of the complex carbohydrates is that it takes them longer to be broken down, and so as they get broken down more and more, you actually get an insulin response over a longer period of time. And it's tricky. It's tricky to balance your insulin with your sugar and then concurrently, reduce how much insulin response you're getting over time. So yeah, carbohydrates. There are different carbohydrates with different glycemic load. and different ratios of fat to protein to carbs. And what you want is you want foods which have a higher ratio of fats, especially in relation to what the carbohydrates are. I bet that fly's got some really good fat to carbohydrate ratios. All right. So I hope this helpful. If you have any questions, shoot me a line at my email, which I'm going to include before, and I'll give you a response to any questions that you guys might have about the topic which I broached in this video. Hey, good luck to you. Bye bye.